Chambord, the dream of a young man with the heart of a medieval knight and the mind of a Renaissance patron. The pleasure palace of a king who sought empire and women with equal passion. During the day, the cries of the royal hunt filled the air. At night, music and whispers of intrigue and romance filled the halls. Join us for a tour of this jewel on the French crown, next on Great Castles of Europe. This is the fertile, sunny valley of the Loire River. The Loire runs through the heart of France, both geographically and spiritually. It was here that in the course of a century of war with England, the idea of France as a nation took shape. Here that the enemy was turned back. And it was here that the kings and queens of France chose to build the most beautiful castles in the world. The year 1520. France prospers under its new king, a young man with a taste for architecture, beautiful women, and the hunt. He has endless ambition for himself and his country. He hopes one day to be an emperor, another Charlemagne. He is determined to make French culture the envy of Renaissance Europe. He conceives of a fantastic creation in the midst of this game-filled forest, the largest, most extravagant, most modern construction of its day, an incomparable palace to astonish the world for generations to come. Chambord. With its many turrets, dormers, and towers, the chateau has been likened both to an overcrowded chessboard and a woman whose hair has been blown loose by the wind. Surely the romantic young king whose dream gave birth to Chambord would have preferred the latter account. Francis I was barely 20 years old when he succeeded his cousin to the throne in the year 1515. Raised and indulged by his widowed mother, Francis grew up steeped in the blossoming arts of the Renaissance. He grew to love tales of knightly bravery and courtly love more than his Latin letters. He preferred the thrill of the hunt to the finer points of statecraft. But he was intelligent and good-hearted, and after a long line of drab and sickly monarchs, the people of France were delighted with their dashing young king. Shortly after his coronation, Francis set off to Italy to win back the Duchy of Milan, which had been lost, regained, and lost again by his family. To the astonishment of all of Europe, he succeeded. During his triumphant tour of Milan, Francis saw firsthand the works of the Renaissance artists and architects he'd learned of as a child. He returned to France with more than a victory, taking home a passion for the things of the Italian Renaissance and dreams of equaling them in his own realm. He even succeeded in persuading an aging Leonardo da Vinci to accompany him back to France, along with the famous painting La Gioconda, better known as the Mona Lisa. With Leonardo's help, Francis set about fulfilling his architectural dreams, first by enlarging this castle at Blois. But Blois belonged to his queen and his children. His stature as a Renaissance monarch demanded that he have his own stately castle, the likes of which Europe had never seen before. His eye would settle on the outskirts of the great forest of Chambord. Some say it was the love of a woman that brought him here, his illicit affair with the beautiful countess who lived nearby. it's just as likely that the abundant game lured Francis to Chambord. And although the marshy ground made the building site less than ideal, Francis had made his decision. His castle would go here. In 1519, workers began the daunting task of clearing and enclosing the estate. They built a 21-mile wall around the grounds, an enormous undertaking that encircled an area the size of Paris. It was a magical time. Francis seemed destined for greatness. Already he was being called a second Charlemagne. But in Germany, another young man was assuming a position of power, a new ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. Just 19 years old, he controlled both Germany and Spain, but longed for more. France and its ambitious young king stood in the way. No one knows exactly who designed Chambord. Clearly it bears the mark of Leonardo da Vinci, but he died just before construction began in 1519. Leonardo's death was a blow to Francis, who revered the artist. One historian movingly describes how the young king held the dying Leonardo's head in his last moments. In truth, Francis was far away, celebrating the birth of his second son, when news of Leonardo's death reached him. The design of Chambord reflects Francis's desire to remake the Italian Renaissance in a French image. The square keep is Italian, but the massive corner towers are French medieval. The room plan is unique, centering on a Greek cross that divides the keep into 4 separate blocks. Where the arms of the cross meet, a magnificent spiral staircase rises. It's constructed so cleverly that someone ascending can see those descending without ever meeting them, because there are actually 2 flights of stairs wrapped around each other. This is the genius of Leonardo da Vinci. These drawings by Leonardo show a staircase designed with 4 distinct flights of stairs. It's likely that the great artist drew these for Chambord, but the master masons overseeing the construction of the chateau simplified the design to just 2 flights. The staircase remains a marvel of engineering and ingenuity to this day. The resulting castle would be all Francis had hoped, an astonishing combination of French tradition, Italian Renaissance, and the genius and whimsy of Leonardo. Of course, Francis made sure that his own mark would be prominently displayed throughout the castle. Another symbol of Francis adorns the castle throughout, the salamander. In legend, the salamander walked through fire unscathed. Francis's mother chose it as a symbol of strength and courage for her son. Here, too, the young king's fierce ambition for empire can be seen. Above the head of each beast is a closed imperial crown, an audacious mark for a mere king. In truth, only his grim young rival, Charles V, would wear the imperial crown. Francis and his castle would pay dearly for his imperial ambitions. In 1525, at the Battle of Pavia, the fates went his enemy's way. Francis was wounded and captured. For a year he languished in a Spanish prison, and building at Chambord came to a halt. In 1526, Francis was able to return to Chambord, more anxious than ever to finish his palace. He had won his release at great cost. Part of France went to Charles V, and Francis's 2 sons went as hostages as well. It was probably during these visits to the building site that Francis decided to add wings to the square keep. Perhaps only then did he realize that the perfect symmetry of the keep had its drawbacks. It divided the chateau into 32 identical apartments, and a king with dreams of empire could hardly live in exactly the same accommodations as his subjects. To preserve that neat symmetry, Francis would add 2 wings, one for the royal apartments and one for the chapel. Thus, the new design would pay tribute to both God and king. But the symmetry is deceptive. A close look at the main facade reveals the royal wing to be slightly smaller than the wing containing the chapel. It's thought that the marshy ground may have forced the builders to lay the foundation for the royal apartments closer to the keep than had been planned. There are other differences in the wings, best seen in the matching staircases on either side. The richly carved one ascending to the royal apartments dates from the 1540s. The one on the opposite side, completed 15 years later, is markedly simpler in decoration. From 1526 on, 1,800 men labored continuously on the building of the chateau. The pleasure palace at Chambord gradually took shape and was ready to greet its first visitors. Francis I was never quite the same after his imprisonment in Spain. The ceaseless struggle with his mortal enemy Charles V took its toll. He was no longer the light-hearted knight. Hunting, one of the great delights of his youth, increasingly became an escape from troubles on his frontiers, and so he and his sumptuous court came to Chambord on such escapes. During the summer, Chambord lay empty. Hunting was a winter pastime. The king would organize hunting trips for his court that lasted from a few days to a few weeks. Hundreds of servants and perhaps 1,000 horses would move from chateau to chateau, lugging all of the furniture, tapestries, chandeliers, clothes, and china that such a royal gathering would require. Readying the chateau for the arrival of the king's court was no simple task. Typical of Francis's flair for the grandiose, the numbers of the court swelled during his reign, including many women of rank. He was fond of saying that a court without beautiful ladies was like a spring without roses. Eventually, his retinue filled every room in the keep, including these large attic rooms. On arrival, the servants would set about transforming the chilly stone castle into a warm and welcoming palace, lighting the fireplaces in each room, hanging tapestries and thick velvet wall coverings. The servants would fit slats of wood into these slots and plaster them with mud and grass. Markings on the beams guided the reassembly. It's no coincidence that the roof beams resemble the ribs of a boat. The roof was built by shipbuilders who worked on the castle during the winter months when the shipyards were closed. Construction of the royal wing was not completed until 1547, the same year Francis died. He may have stayed here in the magnificent king's bedroom during his last visits to Chambord that year, surrounded by those closest to him. In those times, the king might share his bed not only with his wife, but with a favored guest as well. Privacy was not considered a luxury. A retinue of servants surrounded the king, whether he was holding court, hunting in the woods, or asleep in his bed. At night, the servants would sleep in foldable cots around their lord's bed. Francis's presence can be felt everywhere here. The king's study, attached to the bedroom, was designed to offer him a retreat from the hubbub of the court. The richly carved ceiling bears his initial, F, and his totem, the salamander. The king's passion for architecture did not stop at Chambord. In fact, no other French monarch would build as many castles, but it was here at Chambord that his vision of a wholly French Renaissance reached its pinnacle. Here, Francis spared no expense, no effort. Here he indulged every flight of architectural fancy. In many ways, Chambord is as impractical as it is beautiful. Certainly the chateau was not designed with the servants' convenience in mind. No permanent kitchens were built, since the castle was left empty except for a week or two a year. Servants had to cook food in fireplaces in the basement and then carry it up staircases and down long halls to reach the royal apartments. More often than not, the food arrived cold. Therefore, in rooms adjoining each main apartment, so-called potagers were built. Here the food could be rewarmed. Chambord's finest moment, and perhaps Francis's only real triumph over his rival, Charles V, came in 1539. During one of the short-lived truces between the two, Francis threw a week-long reception for his mortal enemy. It is said that swarms of young ladies preceded the emperor wherever he went, scattering rose petals in his path. Charles was suitably impressed, declaring Chambord and its trimmings a synthesis of all that human effort can achieve. On the occasion of such royal visits, days were filled with the hunt. According to tradition, the unique terraces at Chambord were constructed so that the ladies of the court could follow the hunts and admire the gallantry of their lords. It is more likely that these are another mark of the great Leonardo da Vinci, designed to provide a perfect vantage from which to marvel at the forest of fantastic shapes rising from the upper level. Nights at Chambord were for feasting and frolicking. Guests would gather on and around the spiral staircase, whispering and shouting. On the second floor of the keep, music and dancing filled the rooms radiating from the staircase. At night, during the great balls held here, Chambord took on the air of the fairy tale palace of Apollodon the magician, a character from a 14th century Spanish novel of romantic chivalry. Francis had it translated from its original Spanish, and his court gallantly set about emulating it. Chambord's flamboyant outlines might have come straight out of an illuminated medieval manuscript. They capture the romantic mood of a passing age that Francis, the great Renaissance patron, never stopped celebrating. The death of Francis in 1547 spelled the end of the golden age of the Loire Valley. The royal family moved to Paris to be closer to the political center of France. For most of the next 400 years, Chambord lay empty, impossibly beautiful, and virtually impossible to live in. Various owners and VIP guests took up temporary residence here from time to time, each leaving his or her mark, to the extent that much of the feel of the Renaissance chateau was lost. But the central staircase and surrounding galleries remained untouched and were never to lose their power to enchant and intrigue. The double spiral of this staircase made it a favorite place for children to play hide and seek. The wealth of decorative carvings here make it one of the finest examples of the Renaissance carver's art to be found in France, as well as a child's delight. Periodically, Chambord showed the signs of neglect. Decorative features crumbled, roofs leaked, and a number of walls threatened to fall down. Under Louis XIV, Chambord came back to life briefly. The Sun King was thoroughly enchanted by this magnificent building, an architectural foreshadowing of Versailles. He began restorations and built this apartment in the center of the keep, leaving the royal wing unoccupied. Wood paneling, hangings, and parquet flooring brought new comfort to the castle. In keeping with the new fashions of the court, small rooms for maids and servants were added, adjoining a few of the main bedrooms. But again, Chambord refused to succumb to domesticity. Although used occasionally as a hunting lodge for the royals and their favorites, most of the time it remained empty. One of the few people to try to live here on a permanent basis was the Marshal of Saxony. He'd been given the chateau by Louis XV after his brilliant victory at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. The Marshal moved in lavishly and brought with him 2 cavalry regiments that he housed in the outbuildings. He tried to solve the heating problem by installing 4 of these enormous ceramic stoves imported from Germany. The Marshal lived high and hard. A notorious womanizer, he is said to have seduced the famous actress Madame Favart at Chambord. When the Marshal of Saxony died, the cannons of the main courtyard, in keeping with his will, fired a salvo once every quarter of an hour for 6 days. The building of Chambord was never actually finished. Craftsmen and builders have been at work here on and off for nearly 500 years. The restoration goes on to this day, carried out with the same painstaking craftsmanship as under the watchful eye of Francis I. After the masons have set the stoneworkers carve out the magnificent details. This F alone will take some 3 days to complete. Despite the extensive restorations, some of the original stones remain. This one dates from 1533. This is the second major restoration of the lantern tower that crowns the central staircase. During the first restoration in the 1700s, workmen removed most of the original structure and stored it under cover from the weather in a ground floor room under the royal apartments. There it remains to this day. Chambord is now a national treasure, a mecca for tourists, and a stately hunting preserve for the presidents of France and their honored guests. In one sense, despite the passage of centuries, Chambord is still suspended at a momentous crossroads of history, a time when the romance and superstition of the Middle Ages were giving way to the rationality of the Renaissance. In this, it is a remarkable reflection of the idealistic young man who built it. At the heart of a great forest, the magical vision of a man who was at once medieval knight and Renaissance philosopher king remains. Chambord. Chenonceau. It floats in a timeless trance, suspended between water and sky. Fashioned by the imagination and passion of 7 remarkable women, it is known as the Ladies' Castle. Its story is a stirring drama of French romance, money, and intrigue. Join us for a tour of this majestic treasure of the French Renaissance, next on Great Castles of Europe. In France's Loire Valley, among rolling farms and stately woodlands, kings, politicians, and bankers have traditionally sought refuge from the din of worldly events. This is chateau country, the soul of gracious living, set in the heart of France. Here in the province of Touraine, spanning the placid river Cher, is an exquisite miniature of a castle, Chenonceau. It is a charmed product of the Renaissance, a fulfillment of the new desire for light and lightness. It is delicate but enduring, complex but balanced, fanciful but disciplined. Chenonceau's history is a tableau of 7 personalities, 7 strong and worldly women who embroidered its history with spice and drama. Like all castles, Chenonceau began as a strategic stronghold, in this case as a small fortified mansion with a mill set into the granite bed of the river Cher. This was the estate of the once powerful Marc family. It was built in 1513, when Michelangelo had just finished the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. England, Rome, and Spain were about to invade France, and the Marc estate was snatched up by Thomas Bohier, an ambitious financier who'd had his eye on the mansion for years. His wife Catherine oversaw Chenonceau's beginnings. Over the flowing water, on the robust piers and foundation of the stone mill, she built a structure that was part of the land, part of the river. From its square base, Catherine drew an elegantly complex form of projecting towers and rhythmic windows. The varied roof lines, angles are echoed in her additions to the old tower keep. The diverse shapes, the great windows, and the detail of the structure make this dense stone seem light and airy. Inside, Madame Bohier extended this sense of airiness and space with a design innovation that was unique to France, a hallway. From this ample passage, separate doors lead to private living quarters. Previously, these rooms would have all adjoined. The detail of the interiors reflects Catherine's breeding as a woman of means and refined tastes. Her husband had married well and gave her carte blanche to fulfill her vision of a Renaissance palace. In return, she chose Europe's finest craftsmen to create an estate that would advance his aspirations for the Bohier clan. This is the oldest and finest carved wooden ceiling of the French Renaissance. From Italy, the castle's first lady brought this novelty to France, a straight rather than a curved staircase. By 1517, most of the house was complete, and King Francis I praised it as the beautiful palace and house situated on the river Cher, where we might sometimes stay. Cardinal Bohier, a relative, sanctified this intimate chapel. Madame Bohier had skillfully begun what would become one of France's true architectural gems. Again and again throughout the castle, her husband engraved his motto, but its meaning, as shown on the Renaissance chimney in the sitting room, could as easily apply to Catherine Bohier. It says, "If the building is finished, it will preserve my memory." The memory finally bequeathed by Chenonceau's first lady was one of hospitality and welcoming. Chenonceau was a castle in name only. It is actually a chateau, which has the flavor of a castle, as a liqueur has the flavor of a fruit. By the 16th century, mobile artillery had made all but the most massive fortifications obsolete. Chenonceau's turrets and stone walls are disciplined, yet romantic retellings of medieval defenses. Discipline, mixed with awesome beauty and ambition, described the next woman to favor Chenonceau with the spark of her personality. Diane de Poitiers. Gorgeous and witty, known to favor dressing in black and white, Diane would create here the finest garden in all of France. And through sheer guile and force of her will, she would also fulfill Bohiers' ambition, making Chenonceau a resplendent center of French court life. Diane had been King Henry II's governess. Though 15 years his senior, she later became his mistress and lifelong infatuation. In 1547, Henry presented the beautiful Diane with Chenonceau after Madame Bohiers' son lost it in bankruptcy. Diane immediately set about embellishing the castle interiors, commissioning this magnificent carved fireplace for her bedroom. Diane's favor with the king would ultimately make her suffer at the hands of this woman, the king's wife, Queen Catherine. But Diane Poitiers was a more than equal adversary. She styled herself Diane the Huntress and usually got what she went after. Realizing she would lose Chenonceau if anything happened to Henry, she took decisive steps to make the estate legally hers. Through daring court work, she annulled the decree that transferred Chenonceau from the bankrupt Bohier family to the crown. Diane knew the penniless Bohier heirs couldn't afford the debt that came with the castle. She bought Chenonceau for a song. Next, the new owner launched a Napoleonic campaign to make Chenonceau's farms show a profit. Diane had grand plans for renovating the castle's interior and grounds, but the money had to come from somewhere. With a born manager's efficiency, she created a plan of business investment and expansion. Volumes of each meticulous entry is written in her own hand. First, she increased Chenonceau's land holdings and rents and started a new building program. To save money, she cut back on the wages of her staff, reducing her state manager's salary by 30% and taking away his heating and food allowance. Vineyards were planted and new farm buildings sprang up. From her startled employees, Diane demanded regular progress reports. The farm started making real money. The Loire Valley drank good country wine from Diane's wine presses and ate juicy peach apricots from her orchards. And the castle's entrepreneurial mistress didn't stop there. To create the finest garden in France, Diane commissioned 14,000 days of work from local laborers. 9,000 wild violet and strawberry plants were gathered from local woods. 150 mulberry trees were shipped in to feed silkworms Diane bought for manufacturing raw silk. To protect it all, terraces were built high enough to stop a flood, using 7,000 wheelbarrows of stone. Diane's work had taken on the scale of a monument, as majestic an achievement as the castle itself. As a crowning touch, Diane built an elegant bridge across the River Cher, never imagining that this bridge would one day save the castle itself. In just a few years, young Diane had tripled Chenonceau's profits and the value of the estate. Still, it was her rare beauty rather than brains that won her favor and power in France's loftiest circles. This beauty, it was said, came from a daily bath in the Cher, the river that ran beneath her beloved Chenonceau. But in the end, Diane lost both her loves. In a hapless joust at a festival tournament, her patron and lover, King Henry II, caught the point of a lance and died. Then, despite Diane's legal ownership, her hated rival, the Queen, finally claimed the castle for herself. This painting shows Diane portrayed as the Greek goddess of the hunt, now banished from Chenonceau. The next strong woman to occupy the river chateau was none other than the long-suffering Queen Catherine, King Henry II's widowed wife. Any normal woman would have been crushed by years of lopsided comparison with the heavenly Diane. But Catherine was a Medici of the Italian merchant clan. After Henry's death, she set out to best Diane the Huntress in everything. And in her first act, she would drive herself nearly insane. To honor her late husband, she had his monogram, an H, displayed prominently around the castle. She also added doubled C's, her own initials. When she combined them, which was the convention of the time, the results were horrifying. D's, 2 of them, everywhere, the sign of her nemesis, Diane. Diane had been a manager, but Catherine was a queen, one with lots of catching up to do. She began her regal building program by enlarging the chateau. First, she built a 2-story gallery on top of the bridge created by Diane. This would be the grand reception hall her rival had gone without, and Catherine planned many receptions. For now she could afford them. The estate was turning even greater profits. The vineyards had become famous. Silk was spun right on the estate, creating the sought-after Queen's cloth. In Catherine's time, gay festivities lit up Chenonceau, while bloody conflict darkened Paris. Religious reform smoldered throughout the continent. France was surrounded by enemies. Chenonceau became the Queen's stage for statecraft. Like a business lunch in New York, a ball in Touraine was a forum for serious negotiation and alliance building. Catherine's plans for Chenonceau grew more grandiose, just as her funds started to dwindle. The castle bears the scars of her ambition. To this day, the south end of the gallery is marred by unfinished masonry work. Fortunately, Catherine's greatest plan for Chenonceau never left the drawing board. It was for the best. The castle's charm would have been swallowed in this gaudy expansion. Modest improvements were still possible. To cater the outlandishly lavish celebrations she loved to stage, Catherine enlarged the kitchens. The Queen planted her own more formal garden in her native Italian style, fragrant with lemon and orange trees, cooled by fountains and graced by sculpture. These gardens were the site of Catherine's most extravagant celebration. Many of the court women came dressed as men, and the serving women dressed hardly at all. Catherine loved a party. This infamous event became known as the Festival of the Three Queens. Even for Renaissance France, it was an extravagant affair. Staged as an enormous play, its balls, feasts, and masquerades went on for 5 full days. The nights shimmered with thousands of candles, glittered with jewels and brocade, sang with violins. The king appeared as a queen in sparkling drag, accompanied by his favorite boys, known as the cuties. It was difficult to tell, wrote one guest, if one saw a man queen or a woman king. In 1584, the celebrations came to an end. Catherine left Chenonceau to avoid a wave of the plague. She died in the cold beginning of 1589 at Blois, willing the chateau and its estate to her daughter-in-law, Louise of Lorraine, France's new queen. Instead of parties, the castle's next mistress would deck the castle in mourning. In the summer of that year, King Henry III was mortally wounded by an assassin. In his last letter to Louise, he asked her to wait for him at Chenonceau. She did. For 15 years, Louise threw herself into a mourning every bit as theatrical as Catherine's galas, dressed always in the royal mourning costume of white. The castle on the Cher fell quiet, languishing in silence as a virtual tomb. As an interior decorator, the grieving Louise was severe. She painted the walls and ceilings of her chambers black. Themes of death stood out in white against the black. These white plumes covering the walls are an ancient French symbol signifying pain. Elsewhere, tears of grief compete with gravediggers' pickaxes and spades, as well as scratching thorns. Louise had buried herself alive. While arguably deranged, in her self-imposed exile, she carried on charitable work and became known with respect and gratitude as the White Lady of Chenonceau. She also immersed herself in religion, praying at this chapel 4 times a day and adorning the castle with Christian motifs. Her dreams of turning Chenonceau into a convent would not be realized in her lifetime. In 1601, the castle on the Cher passed into the hands of its 5th lady, Françoise de Mercure, daughter-in-law to King Henry IV. She turned out to be the manager Louise never was. For the next 12 years, she worked hard to reverse the structural decay that in her grief Louise had ignored. But now the monarchy of France was changing. Chenonceau became a backwater, a destination only for the hunting season. It saw its last royal visit when Louis XIV passed through in 1650. It was then that permission was finally granted for a Capuchin nunnery to be established in the attic rooms above the main house. The nuns, like other women, left their mark. Here at the head of the grand staircase, at the entrance to the convent, a ceremonial drawbridge separated the brides of Christ from worldly matters. The next mistress of Chenonceau was considerably more lively. The daughter of an actress in the Comédie Française, wife of a wealthy banker, she was a brilliant sun around which the intellectual stars of France revolved, Louise Dupin. The Dupins lived in the center of Paris, but in the autumn, Tourain's most beautiful season, Chenonceau once again became the playground of nobility. But these were the nobles of a new and deadly France. To escape the terror in 1782, Louise Dupin left Paris to live at Chenonceau year-round. It may have saved her life. The French Revolution reached out for her. As a wealthy bourgeois, she was denounced by the Revolutionary Committee. Chenonceau, as a symbol of royal excess, was ordered burned. But the people of Touraine blocked the way. Madame Dupin had been kind, even letting them cross Chenonceau's bridge through the ornate gallery. Her life was spared. The bridge also saved the chateau itself. You cannot burn Chenonceau, the local Monsignor argued. It is the only bridge across the Cher for miles. A few fleurs-de-lis were knocked off, some paintings, and a few pieces of royal furniture were burned in the revolutionary bonfire, but the graceful composition of stone and spirit lived on. In 1799, after the terror, and in the glorious autumn of Touraine, Madame Dupin died at 93 and was buried, according to her wishes, in the woods of Chenonceau. In the 19th century, about the time of the American Civil War, her heirs sold Chenonceau to another wealthy woman, Madame Pelouse. Like 6 women before her, she succumbed to the estate's charm and dedicated herself to a massive restoration campaign, rebuilding, repairing, and replacing. These caryatids, sculptural columns flanking the grand entrance, were moved from the front to the gardens. The bulk of Madame Pelouse's work was dedicated to similar tasks, undoing the ostentatious building and alterations ordered by the chateau's third owner, Catherine de' Medici. But by now the castle badly needed basic structural repair. Ruined roofs and windows were lovingly restored to their former glory. Madame Pelouse stripped the interior of the clutter that had accumulated in the intervening years. Restoring medieval and Renaissance buildings had become a craze of the period, and Madame Pelouse joined it with the utmost enthusiasm. her goal was nothing less than restoring Chenonceau to its original Renaissance elegance and simplicity. In the process, she ran through her entire fortune. She resorted to taking out loans, but paid little attention to the mounting interest. Every ceiling of the proud chateau had by now collapsed. The only exception was this one in Catherine de' Medici's library. Even today, it bears the original paintwork from the era of that imperious lady. There are Catherine's entwined initials. In between restoration projects, Madame Pelouse briefly revived Chenonceau's festive past. On one of those occasions, to evoke true Renaissance spirit, Italian gondoliers punted along the River Cher. But by then, the estate looked considerably better than Madame Pelouse's bank accounts. Creditors paid their respects at the castle. In 1888, the French Land Bank took possession from the last of Chenonceau's grand ladies. Today, the majestic Chenonceau is once again self-supporting. Once more, its gardens are a scene of constant activity, in a style that would make Diane du Poitiers, their original landscaper, proud. The jewel of the Cher is still in private hands, owned now by the Meunier family, France's famous chocolatiers. Tourism has turned the Grand Chateau into a playground the public, not just princes, can enjoy. They are drawn here by this timeless reflection of Chenonceau's 7 mistresses, their taste and wit, intelligence and will. Its elegance and charm are now ours to share, a lightness gliding serenely above the dark waters. Rising from the heart of the Spanish peninsula, an ancient fortress guards 1,000 tales of grandeur, treachery, and madness. Behind its walls, weak kings cowered, warlords plotted, and one remarkable woman freed herself to create a new nation, seek out a new world, and unleash a scourge of inquisition. Join us as we explore the sumptuous halls and mysterious passages of the mighty Alcazar of Segovia, next on Great Castles of Europe. Long before there was a Spain, there was the ancient kingdom of Castile, the center of the Spanish peninsula. Many kings, many nations battled for Castile. Its climate is harsh, its rocky soil studded with many fortresses, but the strongest of fortresses, high and impregnable, is Alcazar, the fortress of Segovia. When was the Alcazar begun? We could say millions of years ago, when upheavals and floods cut out a natural fortress, a lofty, defendable perch with 300-foot walls. The Alcazar commands a strategic choke point where the Auresma and Clamores rivers meet, 70 miles north of Madrid. It keeps within its powerful walls 1,000 tales of betrayal, pomp, and suffering. Another story lingers here, how Spain became a nation. Ancient native tribes lived on this height, using the natural limestone caves against the weather. Roman legions, subduing the natives for the empire, made it a fortified garrison. They used the caves as storerooms, and not only carved out the tunnels and foundations that lie beneath it today, but supplied it with water from the mountains, using a remarkable aqueduct built in the 1st century AD. 128 arches spanning almost 1,000 yards, 12 stories high. Its vital strategic position, controlling the rivers and the passes through the mountains, was worth the effort. By the 5th century, the weakened Roman Empire had retreated, and the high ground above the rivers was occupied by marauding tribes from northern and eastern Germany, the Visigoths. 200 years later, the peninsula had fallen under the sword of Islam. The Moors made Segovia's steep heights into a powerful fortress. They left behind masterpieces of Moorish decoration, patterned walls that display intricate, rhythmic geometry. It was a center of battle for 600 years, changing hands as the Moors were driven back to Africa. In the 11th century, the fortifications were expanded, and the royal apartments were made more comfortable for Alfonso VIII and his English queen, Eleanor. The Alcazar became the northern seat of the Castilian kings who traveled from castle to castle. It was the favorite capital of a remarkable scholar king named Alfonso the Wise, one of the brightest lights of the 13th century. A monarch of enormous intelligence, he was also a poet, musician, and astronomer. From this octagonal observatory, he mapped out the heavens, earning a reputation as a sorcerer. He was said to criticize the state of the heavens, claiming that he would have made them neater and more orderly. A monk warned him to repent of his blasphemous pride. Alfonso refused, until a lightning bolt killed his assistants. Alfonso's repentance is reflected in the decorations of the cord room, based on the humble cord belt of a monk's robe. The Iberian Peninsula that would become Spain was then a hodgepodge of little kingdoms and grasping lords. After Alfonso, Castile and its neighbors were caught up in a plague of civil wars. The Alcazar was a veteran of many sieges when Castile's King Enrique III died in 1406, leaving the Alcazar to his son, Juan II. Like Alfonso the Wise, Juan filled the Alcazar with music, painting, and sculpture. But he was no equal to the earlier scholar king. In the brutal arena of 15th century politics, where assassins and poisons were the common tools of statecraft, he was a misfit. But Juan had an alter ego, a darker side embodied in his advisor and childhood friend, Don Alvaro de Luna. Brilliant, courageous on the battlefield, a cunning strategist, Don Alvaro was the strength behind the throne. Over a long reign, Juan II and Don Alvaro made the Alcazar one of their most important castles, the virtual capital of Castile, even though no single castle was a permanent home to a king. Weeks before a king's visit, these sumptuous rooms would be laboriously prepared for his arrival. Sweet-smelling rushes and herbs would be strewn over the alabaster floors, scented linen spread on the mattresses, the grand halls and little apartments repaired and readied with as much care as the walls were readied for a siege, prepared for a friendly invasion of a king. Hundreds of traveling advisors, servants, relatives, a long baggage train of clothing, paintings, and furniture. For a month or a season, the king and his court lived high and hard. They dropped food and refuse on the floors. They ate, danced, worked, and slept in their heavy robes, bathing seldom, if at all. The smell of sweaty crowds and spoiled food and rich cooking and smoky fires were masked with pungent perfumes. In time, the king's retinue would move on to the next castle, leaving a dismal cleanup job for the Alcazar servants. The reign of Juan II had two faces. One was Juan's gala life of court dances and festivals. The other face belonged to Don Alvaro and the dark business of Castilian politics. The military authority belonged to Don Alvaro. He and Juan probably collaborated on the Tower of Juan II, built high to escape the rapidly improving artillery of the 15th century. There were, of course, some matters of state only Juan could carry out. His first wife died after providing him with an heir to the throne, Enrique. To broaden Castile's power base, Juan then married Isabel of Portugal. Isabel hated Don Alvaro, Juan's shrewd advisor, on sight. Over the subsequent years, she plotted against him. Finally, she persuaded Juan to sign a death warrant for his best and oldest friend. The great Lord Alvaro de Luna was taken to Valladolid and beheaded. Without Alvaro, Juan was lost. How could he rule the kingdom? Who would succeed him on the throne? His first son, Enrique, was a bitter disappointment, and he had little hope for the two infants Isabel had given him. In the year after the king had his friend executed, he sickened and died, declaring that his life had been a sad trial and that he would sooner have been born the son of a simple craftsman. Juan had been right about Enrique. As king, he was stupid and spineless. His libertine court life and his perverted excesses shocked all of Castile, even in a time when the shortcomings of a monarch were often overlooked. The single grand feature of Enrique's reign was the Alcazar itself. No other king loved it as Enrique did. No other passed so much time within its forbidding walls or expended so much money on its decoration. He had spent his youth here, and on this palace he lavished his gold and attention. These magnificent seated figures of the rulers of Castile were crafted for him. 34 of them, from the earliest ruler, Pelayo, down to Enrique himself, an idealized version of this unattractive and even misshapen young man, and with them a figure of his infamously unfaithful queen, Juana of Portugal. He had walls plated with silver. Delicate details were gold-leafed. The splendid hall of pine cones was decorated with golden replicas of the cones from all of Castile's mountain evergreens, and bore an inscription for "Our illustrious Lord, King Enrique. By the grace of God may he live and reign many years." It was not to be. A dissolute ruler like Enrique needed the Alcazar. His nobles scorned him. His people mistrusted him. The walls of this impregnable fortress were all that stood between him and his disgusted subjects. His own castle governor warned him not to leave, calling the fortress the only refuge from your misfortunes. But even a great stronghold cannot protect an unpopular ruler forever, especially a foolish and unpopular ruler. Locked within these intricately adorned walls with him, pampered but virtual prisoners were his half-brother and sister. His half-sister Isabel would trample Enrique's legacy. Isabel and her younger brother Alfonso were sick of Enrique and willing to risk everything. Powerful nobles had allied against Enrique. Desperately, he pledged 16-year-old Isabel's hand in marriage to one of them. On his way to the wedding, the bridegroom ate a hearty meal and died, quickly and painfully. The remaining nobles rushed to open rebellion and spirited away 14-year-old Alfonso, proclaiming him their king. Now there were two kings in Castile. Enrique rode out of the Alcazar to a bloody but indecisive battle at Olmedo, 40 miles away. Both sides claimed victory. After the battle, young Alfonso hurried to the Alcazar to claim the throne of Castile. The fortress has never fallen to an assault, but it opened its doors to Alfonso. Young Alfonso, thinking himself king, had a dinner of mountain trout, was immediately drowsy, and died the next morning. His sister Isabel seemed unshaken by this bit of fate or planning. Enrique, re-established in his beloved Alcazar, offered to forgive his half-sister. He offered her titles and gifts, but she politely refused, asking only one small favor, that she be named next in line for the throne. She proclaimed, of course, that her dear half-brother would live through a long and peaceful reign. Enrique arranged a grand show of reconciliation at Alcazar. He led Isabel, mounted on a white mule, through the streets of Segovia. After a state dinner, they dined together on sweetmeats. Enrique felt a burning pain in his side and was rushed to his bed. He lingered for a year, but never recovered. During that year, Isabel completed one of her boldest and most calculated moves. She chose her own husband, Ferdinand of Aragon. He was her first cousin. They could only marry with a papal dispensation, which they did, though the dispensation was an obvious forgery. King Enrique died in 1474. Isabel immediately mustered all the pomp and splendor that the Alcazar had to offer: the royal jewels, flags, processions, the glittering vestments of the church, and had herself crowned queen. By marrying Ferdinand, ruler of Aragon, she had united the two kingdoms of Castile and Aragon into the state that is now Spain. A woman of remarkable will, intelligence, and character, she determined they should rule as equals. Ferdinand acquiesced, wisely, considering the fate of others who stood in her way. Their motto, Tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, means equal importance, shared dignity, indivisible rule. Spain had become one nation, and the Alcazar was its seat. The fortress of Segovia witnessed the expanding wealth and influence of Spain's golden age under this Renaissance couple. The adventurer and entrepreneur Christopher Columbus bided his time in Alcazar's halls, waiting for an audience, an opportunity to convince Isabel and Ferdinand to finance his plans for a new trade route to the east. They ventured a small grant of ships and supplies. With this meager investment, they won a foothold in the New World and changed the course of history. The Alcazar also saw great suffering in Spain. The years of virtual imprisonment with her half-brother's wicked court, had stored up in Isabel a pious rage. She began the Spanish Inquisition, a fanatic and ruthless crusade to enforce the Church's absolute power over the hearts, minds, and bodies of her subjects. Isabel and Ferdinand arranged the marriage of their daughter, Juana, to a Habsburg of Burgundy called Philip the Fair. With him, into the Spanish coffers should have fallen the rich plums of Flanders and the Netherlands. Queen Isabel had the will for rule. Juana did not. When handsome Philip left her, a virtual prisoner in the castle of Mota, to carry on with his armies and mistresses in the north, she began to lose her grip on sanity. He was an ambitious foreigner, and the Spanish have a long-standing hatred of foreign rule. When Isabel died, Philip seized the reins of Spain. He replaced the leaders of Spain with Flemish nobles of his own. He tried to have Juana declared insane to assume sole leadership of Spain. One city, one fortress held out, the Alcazar. Beatriz de Bobadilla, a friend to Queen Isabel since childhood, swore to defend the citadel the Queen had given to her and her husband, the Marqués de Moya. Philip marched toward Segovia, but he never arrived. The confinement at Mota had developed in Juana a fear of being shut up in castles. She balked at traveling directly to the Alcazar, and the royal procession detoured to a smaller town, where a festival was given. After a fast game of the basketball game pelota, Philip retired with a chill. Juana sat by his bed. Early in the morning, he felt a fierce pain in his side, vomited blood, and died within a week. Juana quickly lost touch with reality. For months, she traveled only at night, dressed in rags, with a miserable company of retainers and the poorly embalmed body of Philip. She occasionally opened the coffin to view the remains of the faithless Philip. She died 46 years after Philip, mad in a dark chamber. She remained queen till the end. Spain's next king, the son of Philip and Juana, was not only heir to Isabel's holdings in Spain and the New World. Charles V was from the royal Habsburg family, whose territory included much of continental Europe. But to the nobles of Segovia in 1521, Charles was an outsider. Charles held to his father's northern roots and replaced officials and nobles with Belgian lords. As Charles traveled abroad for a state conference, his carelessness caused a rebellion. To represent him in his absence, he appointed a Belgian regent. This insult was too much to bear. Segovia's nobles attacked. Forces loyal to Charles retreated to the Alcazar and withstood a 5-month siege. The town of Segovia was all but destroyed by artillery. The nearby cathedral was blasted. In fact, the walls of the Alcazar would never be breached. This secret exit from the royal apartments was never used for escape. It was never needed. It stands today as testimony to the stubborn strength at the heart of Spain's birth as a nation. Where thousands of tourists wander through magnificent, stately rooms. Yet they are closer here to the violent and flamboyant spirit of the early Renaissance than almost anywhere else in the world. A 3-day fire in 1862 consumed some of the glory lent to the fortress by Alfonso the Wise, Juan the Weak, Enrique the Impotent, Isabel and Ferdinand, Philip the Handsome, Charles V. but more than enough remains to make the Alcazar one of the great castles of the world. A walk through its staterooms is a journey through centuries of ceremony and intrigue. It's a look deep into the lives of rulers who helped create the contemporary face of Europe and the New World. Its countless halls and secret chambers still resonate with the history of the ages. Today, under the stewardship of Spain's General Military Archive, the Alcazar continues to dominate the high ground of Castile. It remains faithful to its purpose, forbidding without, lavish within, undaunted and unbroken after 2,000 years of glorious history.